welcome to this second of two sessions with Mark Cole, which is part of a series of webinars that I'm running based on research I'm doing for a book at the moment. In terms of today, there is just the two of us. I'll tell you a bit more about the project and myself in a moment. Mark, would you like to just say who you are for those who are not familiar with you?
Thank you, Steve, and hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Cole. I work currently at NHS Improvement as part of their Leadership and Lifelong Learning team for London, where my business is looking at the leadership needs of service, trying to think beyond health into health and social care, so working more systemically, and I guess that's the final destination after a career such as it is of working in people or workforce or organization development in and around the health service since the start of that. Last year I was lucky enough to have a book published which is called Radical Organization Development, which kind of summarized where my thinking had got to after that, all those years of practice, and what I thought I'd been doing wrong in lots of ways, and what seemed inauthentic to me as I tried to reflect on my practice. And I'm currently working with my colleague John Higgins, who some people may know as the co-author with Megan Rates of a book about speaking up in organisations. John and I are working on a book around leadership, and in particular attending to what we talk about as the headwaters of leadership or management thinking, rather than splashing around in the shallows. And that's why it's been particularly interesting for me having conversations with Steve. Steve and I have worked together, have the pleasure of working together on several occasions, and I suspect we're roughly in the same place in terms of our thinking around leadership and other organisational issues. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So, just a wee bit of contracting. I'm going to keep it quite hierarchical just for speed, just to encourage you to be fully present and where possible have other things off. If you can, turn notifications off just so things are not ponging. It says here mute when talking. We're a big group, that's the only reason I say that. If we were a smaller group, I'd say not, but as we're quite big, great. As ever, I'd encourage us to be honest. We don't always have to agree with each other, but be honest and respectful, and be curious. Seek to understand rather than necessarily to reach violent agreement. In terms of the technology, I'm assuming that after 6 months of lockdown, if there's one of you that hasn't encountered Zoom, it's almost where have you been for the last 6 months, as Zoom seems to become part of our day-to-day life from when we wake up to when we go to bed. If you have any questions about that technology, then please ask and we'll be able to help. But the bit of technology I will share with you that not everybody always has experience of is menti.com. If you could open up a web browser, or if you've downloaded the app, open the app. And when you open menti.com, you will see a code on the screen now. Enter that code, and there will be a few moments during the session where there will be some whizzy technological participant interaction. It also, less frivolously, allows us to collect some data, and all that data will be shared with you as well. When I send out the links to the recording and also the slide deck, you will get all that data as well. And you'll get the data from the first webinar that we ran last week. So, just to begin the process, before we get into things more fully, I would like to invite you to go to menti.com, and I'd like you to answer the question, what is your go-to leadership development model or theory? Just by way of a start to our conversations, and to get a bit of a sense of what's out there. So Claire, you've just joined. If you go to menti.com, I'll just ask a question of the group. What is your go-to leadership development model or theory? If you go to menti.com and use that code, you'll be able to put your answer in. Some nice answers there. So if we had a top 10 of charts, looks like Servant is in the lead. And we see also the eclecticism there as well. Nice. Thank you. And the reason for asking this question is just to bring to the surface that some of us have a go-to, some of us have a preferred one, and there are also people out there who will sell religiously almost and intently their particular version of a solution to the development needs of organisations. So it's a knowingly loaded question. Thank you. So, just a wee bit about today. I'm going to tell you a wee bit about the project frame today. Me and Mark will then have a conversation to hopefully bring to surface some of the themes that are emerging from the research, and then I'll give you a chance to have some conversations as well. A wee bit about the project. So for those of you who are not familiar with me or my work, I'm an organisational development consultant, a leadership development consultant, a facilitator, a coach, amongst other things. And for the last few years, increasingly, I've become aware or more conscious of the straining and the rhetoric around different players who offer apparent certainty when it comes to complex organisational challenges. And that rhetoric is used by people like me when I sell my services sometimes, by business schools, by leadership development consultancies. You also see that rhetoric from the fields of practice. So as co-chair of the OD Network Europe, I'm very conscious how as a community and field of practice, we have a position on what is an appropriate answer to an organisation's solutions. So do sometimes HR and leadership development and change practitioners. The rhetoric out there at the moment, particularly with COVID, is you can't go do a Google search at the moment without stumbling across the phrase, there is no silver bullet. It is as much part of folklore now, or kind of cliche, as the phrase, there is a silver bullet. So my intent with the book and my intent with these webinars, as well as being an open inquiry, is to disrupt the narrative around silver bullets and to reveal things in terms of how they actually are. And that includes me also having my own assumptions challenged. So I have no problem with my assumptions being challenged, I hasten to add. I'd just like to ask you another question, however, which is, what question does leadership development answer? So if you could go to menti.com and put in your answer to that, I would be most grateful. Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry. What question does leadership development answer? I went too fast. Interesting first response. Yeah. There is some of the research I'm doing at the moment is, and you'll see something I share shortly with you, that one of the major critiques of leadership development is that it starts with the individual, whereas actually it's the systemic and the wider context that actually you have to begin with. So that's an interesting observation. In the second one there, what people want from their leaders, raises the question, who are the people? I assume the certainly is certainty, or is that certainly? Interesting one. Problem leaders rather than org leadership. There's some interesting responses here, different to last Thursday as well. And clearly, again, I ask this question with a kind of knowing awareness that I'm asking a group of predominantly practitioners. So who answers this question is crucial. Answering this question from a perspective of HR, you'll get a different answer to if you answer that question from a learning and development, or from an OD, or from a C-suite, or from a senior leadership team perspective. And that question is not always articulated, is one of the experiences I have working with clients. It is not always the case that they are clear on the question they're seeking to answer generally, let alone within the context of leadership development. So I'm going to move on. A little bit of context. Let's frame leadership development and management education in the context of almost the industrial complex of learning. This is in US dollars, but you can clearly see it's a large business. It comes from a US perspective, so they give you the North America spend, but nonetheless, we can do a quick assessment that as a global industry, this is huge. This is not small beans. There is a lot of money being spent on developing leaders and managers in organisations. The question is it actually having the impact that organisations who are spending that money actually think it could have? Well, one of the people who critiques it quite neatly is a man called Jeffrey Pfeffer. One of the things he talks about, he says there are three primary problems. Firstly is the one of bad measures. And to give you a sense of his thinking, he says there's not a scintilla of evidence that more people in leadership roles are adhering to the many prescriptions offered. And he goes on to say that Bill Gentry from the Centre for Creative Leadership, reviewing the evidence, estimated that about 1/2 of all leaders were failures in their roles. Unquote. The next one, no credentials required. This is another interesting one. One of the reasons that management is not a profession, like medicine or law, Pfeffer says, is that anyone can claim to be an expert with no licensing, no certification, or even experience required. Nor do people practicing management, or worse yet, dispensing management advice, need to show even the remotest interest in learning anything about the domain in which they're practicing. And if I speak from when I joined Roffey Park a few years ago, about 7 years ago now, I came from a background where it's fair to say I did not have any senior leadership development experience. No. But within a year, I'm running leadership development and management education programs. Where's my credibility and expertise in that? Certainly I know stuff. I've worked in organisations. I know a lot about organisational change. But I personally hesitate to say that I'm an expert in this stuff. And yet many do claim to be. And the third one is we don't really want what we say we want in leaders. And if you look at public discourse and political discourse at the moment, this should be fairly self-evident. So, quote, we say we want modesty, but field studies and experiments in organisations and settings of all types, including the military, suggest that narcissism and its correlates, including displaying even unwarranted self-confidence, are the path to career success, unquote. So, there's a lot of conventional wisdom, as Pfeffer says at the bottom there, about leadership, which is based more on our hopes and aspirations than any kind of reality or data or science. There's a set of flawed assumptions as well, and this article, which you have the link to here, I highly commend to you to read. It's changed my thinking quite a bit. But fundamentally, the thing I pulled out of this article is that most leadership development starts with an assumption on the part of those both buying it and delivering it, that you start with the individual and you build out from that. All the evidence is that if you come at it from that perspective without addressing the context within which the development happens, the gains you make will best be minimal and the worst will evaporate in very short order, unless you address the context within which that development takes place, and that includes psychological safety, the behaviour of senior leaders, etc., etc. So there's a number of flawed assumptions that we make. And lastly, by way of setting the scene, the suggestion is that there's a functional collusion, a phrase which I took from Graham Curtis, who I've been talking to quite a bit. And this quote is from Martin Parker, who is also somebody who fits in that category of critical management theory. And it's interesting that people who critique management theory and business education get lumped into critical management studies rather than being accepted as dissenting voices within the broader sphere of theory, leadership theory. And this quote here, I think, says something quite important, at least to me, which I'll leave you to read. And the only thing I'm going to highlight myself is that bit at the bottom. In every case, and here he's talking about business schools, the business school, he suggests, act as an apologist, selling ideology as if it were science. And that gets me wondering, how often have I sold an ideology as if it were science, as if it were fact, as if it were the most important thing? Because HR often has a certain ideology, OD has a certain ideology, so do org design, and so do particular leadership teams. So, one more question before me and Mark roll into our conversation, before we invite you to. And I think it's an important one. Who benefits from leadership development? If you could answer that on menti.com, that would be great. So just to take up this idea that it's all benefit, or the organisation benefits. One of the people I interviewed for part of the research for my book is a very senior HR leader in a major UK insurance business, and she commented that the entire learning and leadership development budget for that organisation, her language, was blown on 5 general managers to go to a business school and do very lengthy programs there. And her observation and critique was, how on earth could just spending all that money on just 5 people be the most impactful way of using limited resources to affect change in an organisation? So who benefits from leadership development, I'd suggest, is actually a little bit more nuanced, depending on who has the power and how they choose to exercise that power and where they choose to spend that money. So the hypothesis that me and Mark are going to play with before we invite you to consider it in groups, is that leadership development and management education by extension are part of this wider functional collusion that fuels the quest by those that lead and run organisations for silver bullets and guaranteed fixes. I'm going to start this conversation with Mark by actually picking up something that happened as a result of our first conversation last week, because we're not going to repeat exactly what we said last Thursday. That would be an absurdity, because this is not scripted. And one of the things that Mark posted on LinkedIn after the event was that some of that conversation had sparked an evolution of his own thinking. So Mark, I wanted to start by asking you what has changed or evolved in your thinking in response to our hypothesis?
It was, excuse me, it was one of those interesting circumstances where the conversation and some reading I'd been doing kind of connected together. And so often, I think, with our learning and our development and our thinking, it's about connecting the dots rather than something revelatory becoming apparent to us. The revelation comes in a connection. And the connection was, I've been reading a book. It's quite a slender volume, but I'm making very slow progress through it, by someone called Harter, who teaches out in the States. And his book is called Foucault on Leadership. So it's about Michel Foucault, and 2 sets of lectures that Foucault delivered towards the end of his life that were looking at the care of the self, how you attend to your personal needs for your improvement, your development, the creation of you as a subject, an individual as a subject. And it's an interesting book because he's picking through how Foucault was talking about these things. And so I've been working through it at a quite academic level, but during the course of our conversation last week, somebody simply said, actually, what we should do is develop the person and then see whether that helps them to lead. And that kind of instantly connected with what Harter is actually saying in the book, which is that we spent so much time around leadership development as a particular practice, which is a development process against a model that we hold in our heads, or a discourse that we hold in our heads, which is called leadership. Where in actual fact, if leadership is to mean anything, it means to develop someone to have the capacity as an individual to be confident in themselves, to assume leadership if it comes up against them. So that for me was the revelation. I don't expect other people to share that, but it was a penny dropping moment, which is that we talk about leadership development, and it's a development practice against a practice of leadership, which we then define in our heads. Whereas in actual fact, if we were supporting people to develop a care of themselves, a greater understanding of themselves, a richness in terms of working with others and alongside each other, just in and of itself, if we were investing that effort in everybody across an organization, then more people might move into leadership on the basis of that development of their self. I hope that makes sense. It did when I thought it. It may not when I say it.
Yeah. And if I kind of, where I've gone with that, I don't know why this is rattling through my head, because you started talking there about the individual, but there's something here for me about how, when we talk about leadership development, the assumption is often that we're talking about developing a particular cadre or a particular group of people who are anointed to become the leaders or better leaders of the entity that is the organization. And I guess I'm just questioning the assumption that changing organizations for the better is a function of developing people who you anoint to be somehow rather more elevated than others.
I think that's true. So I get there's something interesting work you mentioned, Martin Parker. Martin has produced what I take to be a really fascinating book just called Against Management. And it literally takes our fascination with management and picks it apart from a critical perspective. And as you say, you see people doing that kind of work shunted into a silo. So that is where critical management thinking goes on. And then it doesn't need to infect the mainstream thinking. And similarly, there's a school of work developing around critical leadership studies, and two writers, Learmonth and Morell, wrote a book about critical leadership quite recently, and they make an interesting distinction about where does the term leadership come from? Why are we having this conversation today? Why do organizations obsess about leadership and its development? Why have we gone from where we were to where we are? Why has leadership suddenly appeared in the discourse in the way that it has? And I suppose for me, that's very often a starting point in terms of the way in which I critically engage with some of these ideas, which is I don't want to say what is leadership, because that takes me into a kind of circular notion, but I want to say why is leadership? So why is leadership, and how does it connect with other thinking that goes across organizations? And to go to your point about individuals, there is for me, and it kind of it's reflected in the work that John Higgins and I are doing, there is a sense in which, for me, the individual is a critical part of organising, because unless the individual as a human agent connects with others, then we don't get organising, we don't get things done. But I think in the neoliberal world in which we live, there's a very heavy ideology around individualism and the obsession with the individual. So I think two things in answer to your question. First, we've become obsessive about the idea of leadership, and that only certain people will be leaders and others will be followers. And that reproduces itself, notwithstanding what we might say about different leadership constructs like servant leadership. The cultural presence of leadership, wherever we look, is still throwing itself back into a heroic, charismatic picture, and it rarely breaks free of that when you look at the practice of it. So there's this issue of leadership as a thing that's kind of stepped into the space, and secondly, there's the issue of the individual. So I think you're right. We obsess with a particular cadre of people that we want to develop to be something called a leader, but we're not actually thinking under the surface, getting to the underneathness of that, which is why is leadership now? Why is leadership and not management? And there's an interesting distinction there, because we talk about leadership and followers, and we talk about managers and workers, and the second term intimates a certain tension in the corporate setting between a manager and a worker, that they might not have a shared agenda. But we're all wearily aware that when we talk about leadership and followers, then we very often get cudgeled with the notion that we're all in the same boat. Well, actually, we're not.
And if I was to pick up the thread of something we didn't really cover last week as much, but the question of um, the extent to which there is a functional collusion that goes on amongst, or well, amongst the players who offer leadership development management education, and also the buyers.
Mm-hmm.
That there's this kind of tacit assumption that if we buy this, then there will be an answer to our leadership problems. To what extent do you go with that as a hypothesis?
You're leading the witness, Your Honour. But I'll happily take that line. The work that John and I are doing talks very much about that functional collusion, and we take a perhaps slightly more hostile view, which is that there are a range of ideologues that are converting the way in which we think in a corporate setting in an unhelpful fashion. So whether you're looking at the thought leadership that drizzles out of the professional service companies, not much of which sticks in a meaningful way, if you're looking at what business schools produce by way of research and such like, if you look at all these different perspectives, including us as practitioners and the way in which we interpret the requests of a particular commissioner of a program, then all of those things connect and constellate to create a discourse of leadership which obfuscates the practical question, which is, what is the organizing that we're trying to doing, and how could we do it better? So we go off on a line that says, it's quite a simplistic line, which says, actually, it's a problem of leadership. And it may not be. It may be a problem of communication, it may be a problem of connection, it may be a problem of people not talking successfully enough. We think that leadership is a response to that, and it works in a particular way because it has followership with it. So I think there's a functional collusion between, and this as you describe these, or as I articulate this, it begins to sound slightly like a conspiracy. And as a good Foucauldian, I don't see conspiracies. I see a shaped way of thinking that preoccupies a society in a variety of ways by establishing predominance of certain ideas, which in turn make other ideas less palatable. So it's not, they're not bad people in charge of things, but the functional collusion is very much about, first of all, we've arrived at a point where leadership seems to be the answer to something, but very few people are asking the meaningful question that might get them to a different kind of answer. And secondly, there are then plenty of people, including me, I'm forced to admit to my shame, who are happy then step into the breach to offer very quick, off-the-shelf leadership development type interventions, whereas in actual fact, a richer and more detailed and slightly more skeptical and critical conversation about human organizing and what organizations are trying to achieve might be more productive. So I collude as well. I collude.
Yeah, and just before we move into breakout groups, what hove into view in my mind's eye, it's not a particularly pleasant thought just before lunch, is Boris Johnson. And if we look at Boris Johnson and his colleagues there as a senior leadership team in the cabinet, and you ask the question, well, how would you address the behaviour and the poor leadership, in inverted commas, if you go with the idea that there is some poor leadership being exhibited at the political level, then would a leadership development programme be the answer? And yep. Isn't that actually the most beautiful example of it's the wider systemic context and our collective collusion with allowing these people to be in power? So this doesn't happen in isolation, I guess, is my reflection there.
That observation, contemporary observation, goes to the point, I think, about the discourse around leadership stands at odds with what many of us are trying to do in terms of thinking differently about it. So there is that kind of periodization of leadership, historicization of it that says, here's where it appears, and here's where business schools get involved, and this is where they start selling their wares. And it's a fairly cynical view of an arc, a narrative arc around leadership. But I do think we sit, I do this regularly, and I make this observation quite regularly. If you were old-fashioned like me and bought a hard copy of a newspaper today and went from front cover to back cover, then the picture of leadership you're going to absorb from the news pages, the politics pages, the business pages, and the sports pages is completely at odds with the sorts of leadership that perhaps we as developers of individuals and organizations would necessarily want to articulate. And so we're up against quite a significant tide of very subtle, almost tacit thinking about leadership, which constantly reinforces its quite traditional perspective.
Marvellous, Mark. Thank you. I think that last statement there is going to find its way into the book. So I'll be sending you another bottle of champagne or your favourite.
Thank you.
So on that note, I'm going to put people into breakout rooms of 3 or 4. So I'm just jiggling things because somebody came and somebody left. I'm going to give you a good 15 minutes, and the question I'm going to invite you to consider, just by way of encouraging the conversation, is this simply. Which is, how do you reflect upon and think differently about the assumptions and thoughts you came with, having heard what you have so far? It is as open as that. So as you arrive back, if you'd be willing on menti.com, it's just a first pass, just to share a top-level reflection, personal reflection from your conversation before we open up into a plenary for it. So if you go to menti.com and just share a high-level reflection conversation with colleagues. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. A nugget would be ample. I may be preaching to the choir here. That's always possible. Although on one of my earlier webinars with Simon Kavickia, there was somebody there who did say that they had the silver bullet to all organisational challenges. So not everybody's in the choir. And it's interesting, even if we are part of the same choir, it begs the question why we're not more successful in changing the narrative. So how are we colluding, functionally or otherwise, with our clients, that we are not able to change the narrative and shift it sufficiently, that these questions are actually irrelevant? How come the preoccupation with programs? Yes, with a big fat yes on it. I agree totally. And when I talk to clients now, I actually actively, consciously attempt to move them away from programmatic interventions and talk about leadership supervision and action inquiry and action research across time. It all begins with how you define leadership. It does, absolutely. And also we have to be careful that we don't assume that there's one right definition, because there are different definitions that vary depending on context. Interesting, very fruitful discussion. Developing a team, nice, yeah. I love this one. We need to have bigger and better conversations with our clients about leadership development. I was on an exchange this morning on LinkedIn, which for those of you who are connected with me or not, you could find it, where I had an exchange with Ian Reid, very interesting man, about how often is it you see OD consultants, independent practitioners, forget for a moment big consultancies, actually in their offering saying, well, actually, I don't have a clear answer. I don't have something that's neat that is going to solve your problems. We actually front up that actually our offerings are, by definition, fairly dirty and don't have any guaranteed outcomes. Because certainly, I think many of us do present a degree of certainty in how we pitch to clients, even if intellectually and conceptually we don't necessarily collude with them. So lovely comments there. So I just want to open this up now for a few minutes before we go through just a couple of closing things. To anybody who wants to, either in the chat, throw a question out to all of us, or to me and Mark, or yeah, just have a brief plenary space. What's there to be said out loud? Well, Mark, do you have any reflections? If you can hear noise here, by the way, I'm in my shed in Brighton and I'm right next to a garage with lots of hairy mechanics who are thwacking things. So I apologise for the noise if you can hear things. Anybody have anything they want to throw in? Okay, lovely. And Chris, what have you seen? When have you seen it work well? I assume, Chris, you mean by leadership development. I guess my answer to that is I've seen stuff work well in the moment. I've seen participants and leaders talk about shifts in their map of the world and how they view things. One of the other things that strikes me is that it's incredibly rare for me to work with a client who, when you talk to them about evaluation, is prepared to do an evaluation across time to evidence whether or not leadership development has had an impact. So most of my evidence for what's worked well is anecdotal, when I've personally, in an informal way, gone back to people who I've met through my work and said, how are you doing? Has anything changed? And what tends to have worked well is when I have, either solo or with colleagues, probably been more challenging, got crunchier, how the mirror up, and being prepared to ask questions that either individually or collectively were being avoided, and worked with people to see whether or not there's something that they want to choose to do that might make a difference to their lived experience. It's a function of that. But it's a very ropey answer in some respects. Gareth, thank you for that. Something about working with expectations of providing something that fixes and holding space for something that helps explore the idea of fixing. Yeah, I like that. One of the things that Mark talks about is the myth of fixability, the illusion of fixability. I agree totally with that. I mean, one of the things I'm taking to doing is I don't talk about solutions with clients anymore. I don't talk about a solution in the sense of a fix. I'm quite happy to talk about a solution in terms of a chemical solution, where what I bring may mix with what you bring, and together we may come up with a solution that together might have some kind of efficacy or impact. So that's what that triggers in me, Gareth. And I agree, Phoebe, the effectiveness of the leaders depends on the context. There's a kind of chicken and egg there, which is who creates the conditions for the context. Whilst you were all in breakouts, me and Mark were having a conversation about culture. And one of the things that I thought or observed is, I don't think I've ever heard a client or a senior leader open up a conversation about challenges they're facing with their culture with a line along the lines of, I think we have a problem with our culture and I'm wondering what role I play in that. It tends to be, we have a problem with our culture, we need to fix it. We need to address it by working with the leaders in the organisation, and they need to, ... And the most wonderful example of that was a few years ago working with a very large global motor manufacturing company who sent their next generation of very senior leaders on a talent program that spanned 14 months. And their task was to come out being better able to influence and lead culture change. But the challenge was that the senior leaders in that organisation had failed to make the connection between the rhetoric of culture change and the reality, which was until they started behaving themselves differently as senior leaders, then there was going to be no change. And yet they spend a fortune on this program. A fortune. What else do we have here? I agree with the holistic view. Leadership is seen as one part, yeah. That's an interesting one, Helen. Those most in need of development are often the most closed, especially in expert cultures. That's an interesting one. I don't have an answer to that. I think that's a really telling observation. Mark, the NHS, that comes into mind there when I think about the NHS, that you have lots of experts, and my experience of the NHS is there are a reasonable number of people who are probably in real need of some form of development and support, but because of their expertise, they resist it. And with great pain to themselves. Okay, as we wend toward the close, just check, is there anything else anybody wants to say, either by taking their mic off or through interpretive dance through the Zoom camera?
Yeah, I just like to share some aspect, Steve, which I noticed. For example, and even if we have huge investments in leadership development, if the organizational culture is of not having that trust in place, and if there is no culture of allowing speaking up, it will be more useful for the individual that I received that leadership training. I developed myself, but organization may not gain anything out of that.
Yeah, and that's one of the tensions that is really explicitly called out in the article I referred to in the presentation. It explicitly talks about psychological safety, and that you can start with the individual, but often you spit people out at the end of programs who are now equipped to ask the questions that they were not able to ask before and want to ask them, and suddenly run headlong into a system and a culture that actually is not changed to be ready for them. And that is the thing. You're right, I agree with you. And that then raises a question about how much courage does the individual then have? Because it then comes down to your own choice. Am I more willing to live with the consequences of speaking my truth, even though I've now come out of a leadership development program and I'm ready to ask these questions? or would I rather live with the consequences of kind of recognizing that there isn't the safety and I might lose my job? And that's the ethical tension. And I think we as consultants and practitioners have that as well. When do we actually not speak what actually a client might need to hear, if we are really honest with ourselves about being of service to the wider system, because actually we really want the work, or because we have the bills to pay after 3 or 6 months of lockdown, or. There's some interesting research from the Oxford Review, which I read earlier this year, which kind of really shocked me in terms of the lack of ethics amongst consultants. It really shocked me. It got me thinking about us as a wider community of consultants with a small c, and left me in some doubt as to just how genuinely prepared to be helpful in service of clients some of us are. And if anybody's interested, I have got permission to share that so privately, as it were. So I'm quite happy to send that short paper to you. So I'm going to, with a couple of minutes left, just going to close up by this, which is, bear with me as I rearrange my screen. Briefly, just to tell you what's coming next, I'll send out recordings to last week and this week, sometime later this week, depending on how busy it is. There is a newsletter for the project on MailChimp, and I'll make sure you get the link to that if anybody's interested. The next webinars are going to be with Naomi Stamford, where we talk about, well, what happens when you as a practitioner or a consultant, particularly if you're a practitioner or consultant who's a recognised name and a reputation, what gets projected onto you in terms of your ability to come with guaranteed answers and silver bullets, and do you believe with that or not? And also we'll talk with Naomi about her experience and her views on whether there is any such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to complex problems. Dates and details of that to follow. And the very last thing is just, if you wouldn't mind, because each of these webinars has changed slightly every time I've done them as I change things. How was today for you, in a nutshell, if you're willing to tell me? And other than that, whilst you do that, I will simply say a big thank you to Mark for his time, his wisdom and his thoughts and his willingness to play. And thank you all for coming and playing with me and being part of this inquiry. I can't emphasise enough that as I write this book, it is an open inquiry. And my thinking is evolving as I go, and it evolves as I have conversations with people like you. So I'm genuinely grateful to you for showing up today and playing with me and with Mark and with each other. So go well, and I hope to see you all either virtually or in the real at some point, and stay safe. Some nice responses there, thank you very much. You're welcome, Jose. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Annie.